You are jolted awake in pitch blackness by a deafening, splintering crack. The air is freezing, tasting of salt and copper, as the ornate ceiling above you suddenly caves in with crushing, unnatural weight. You can hear the violent rush of water and the frantic screams of your attendant beside you, but you cannot see her. The luxurious wooden floor beneath your feet tilts violently, plunging you into the freezing, ink-black waters of the sea.
This was not a nightmare. It was the Bay of Naples, illuminated only by a brilliant canopy of stars. The exact date was late March in the year 59 A.D. The woman fighting for her life in the freezing Mediterranean swell was the most powerful woman in the Roman Empire and mother to the emperor. And the vessel dragging her into the abyss was not the victim of a sudden storm or a navigational error. It was a highly complex mechanical murder weapon, custom-built and meticulously engineered by her own son. She breaks the surface of the water, gasping for air as the freezing temperature shocks her lungs. The wreckage of the imperial pleasure barge groans and snaps in the darkness, its heavy timbers listing unnaturally to one side. Nearby, her loyal attendant thrashes in the violent waves, desperately screaming for help toward the shadows of an approaching rescue boat. "I am the Emperor's mother!" the attendant cries out, hoping the imperial title will guarantee her immediate salvation. "Save me!" From the gloom, long wooden rowing oars and heavy bronze-tipped boat hooks swing down in a rhythmic frenzy. They do not reach out to pull the screaming woman to safety. Instead, the sailors smash the heavy wood downward with extreme prejudice until she sinks beneath the waves. The mother watches this brutal event from the freezing swell, treading water in absolute silence. A sharp piece of the collapsing ceiling has torn her clothing, and the salt water burns. But the physical pain is entirely eclipsed by a horrifying psychological realization. The rescue crew are the assassins, and her son's tender reconciliation dinner just hours earlier was an elaborate theatrical trap. She understands the terrifying mathematics of her immediate survival. To live through the next 5 minutes, she must abandon her identity and swim in absolute silence. She slips away from the splintered wood, moving stroke by agonizing stroke toward the faint distant lights of the dark shoreline. She knows that just a few miles away, the most powerful man on Earth is sitting in his sprawling villa, eagerly waiting for his fleet commander to deliver her waterlogged corpse. She drags herself onto the sandy beach alive, discovered by local fishermen who pull her from the surf. But as she is carried to her private seaside villa, a terrifying question remains. How does a mother tell the emperor she survived his murder attempt without triggering an immediate, more violently direct execution? According to the concurrent historical accounts of ancient chroniclers, the events of that night in the Mediterranean are not a myth or a dramatized legend. Despite their differing political biases and the decades separating their writings, all three historians agree on the bizarre, undeniable core of this event. The young emperor commissioned a collapsible boat, loaded its canopy with solid lead weights, and designed the ceiling to crush his own mother before sinking into the sea. But why go through such theatrical, wildly unpredictable lengths to kill one woman? To understand the architecture of this assassination, we have to step back from the cold water and examine the strict, religiously terrified legal codes of the era. Under ancient Roman law, the ultimate taboo, the crime that polluted the very earth itself, was the murder of a parent. To strike down a parent was not just a felony, it was a direct affront to the gods that required a horrifying, highly ritualized purification. The legal punishment was known as the penalty of the sack.
a patricide would be stripped of their fine garments, beaten with blood-red wooden rods, and sewn alive into a heavy leather sack alongside a wild dog, a rooster, a monkey, and a venomous viper. The squirming, biting, terrifying sack would then be loaded onto an ox cart, driven to the sea or the nearest river, and thrown into the depths so the murderer's corpse could not defile the soil.
The young emperor, even as a god-king with absolute authority over millions of lives, could not simply order his mother's public execution without risking a massive religious revolt from the Roman populace and a mutiny from the elite military guard. He needed the plausible deniability of a tragic shipwreck. Scholars now understand that this mechanical boat required immense logistical effort, secret dry dock engineering, and the complicity of top naval commanders, proving that the emperor's madness was not a spontaneous frenzy. It was a highly organized, clinical operation designed to bypass the legal system. If you want to uncover the meticulously engineered atrocities and the hidden historical cover-ups that traditional textbooks gloss over, make sure to subscribe and join us as we dig deeper into the darkest archives of the human past. The perfect crime, however, had just failed due to sheer architectural luck. Ancient records state that the sturdy wooden posts of the mother's bed frame miraculously caught the immense weight of the falling lead canopy, saving her from being crushed instantly. The complex collapse mechanisms jammed, the boat listed instead of sinking cleanly, and the emperor was left waiting in his massive villa for a confirmation that would never arrive. To understand why a son would spend months engineering a floating death trap for his mother, you have to look at the macro context of Rome's imperial court. The ruling dynasty wasn't just a government or a royal family. It was a lethal gilded cage where poison was a standard political tool, where uncles removed nephews, and where family bonds were strictly viewed as massive tactical liabilities. The mother was not a helpless victim. She was the most ruthless apex predator the Roman court had ever produced. She had forged her son into an emperor through a decade of calculated shadows. She had exiled her rivals, ruined her enemies, and, according to contemporary historians, poisoned her own husband, the previous emperor, with a tainted mushroom to clear the path to the throne for her teenage son.
During the early years of his reign, the mother didn't just advise him, she ruled through him. She boldly placed her own face on Roman imperial coins alongside his, a shocking breach of Roman patriarchal norms. She even demanded to listen to highly classified Senate meetings from behind a velvet curtain, positioning herself as the true architect of the empire. His attempt to kill her was not just a political purge to consolidate power, it was a psychological dam breaking. He realized that as long as she breathed, he was merely a puppet acting out her script. But by attempting to sever the bond with the woman who created him, the young emperor didn't free himself. He triggered an inescapable paranoia. The systemic nightmare of Rome was that absolute power insulated its rulers from reality, eliminating anyone who could tell them no, and leaving them trapped in an echo chamber of their own escalating terrors. He believed he had orchestrated a clean, surgical break from his past, but the physical arrival of his mother's messenger was about to introduce a lethal psychological contagion into the palace. The tension inside the imperial villa becomes suffocating as the sun begins to rise. It is the early hours of the morning, and the emperor is pacing frantically. The mother's freedman, a loyal servant, is escorted past the heavily armed elite guards and into the private quarters. The servant delivers a carefully crafted, desperate lie engineered by his mistress. He bows deeply and announces that through the mercy of the gods, the mother has survived a terrible boating accident, and she begs her son not to trouble himself by visiting her as she needs rest. The emperor's reaction is not relief,
but sheer hyperventilating terror. He knows that she knows the truth. In his fevered mind, he already sees her marching on Rome, using her vast wealth to bribe the legions or rallying the guard by displaying her torn clothing to the soldiers who swore loyalty to her family. Panic consumes the room as the emperor summons his two highest advisors, his former tutor, a great Stoic philosopher, and the hardened prefect of the guard. The emperor explains the botched assassination and demands an immediate solution. The silence in the room is deafening. Neither the philosopher nor the military commander wants to speak the treasonous words required to resolve the crisis, knowing that advising the murder of the emperor's mother is a crime that could see them executed if the political winds shift. The philosopher finally looks at the military commander and asks if the elite guards can be ordered to finish the job. The commander coldly shakes his head, stating that the guards are too loyal to the memory of the mother's father, a great and beloved general. They will not raise a sword against his daughter. Finally, the fleet commander, an architect of the failed mechanical boat, steps forward from the shadows. Humiliated by the failure of his naval trap, the naval commander volunteers to take a detachment of Marines and finish the job with cold steel. The young emperor, weeping with relief, declares that this is the first day he truly feels like a ruler, and he sends the assassins into the dawn. We follow the heavily armed Marines as they march down the coastline and violently breach the mother's quiet seaside villa. They smash through the heavy wooden doors, terrifying the household slaves who scatter into the surrounding gardens. The armed men surround her dimly lit bedroom. A towering naval officer steps forward, gripping a heavy wooden club, while a centurion forcefully draws his short iron sword. Her final, defiant stand is a testament to her ruthless lineage. Recognizing that the end has arrived, the mother does not cower, weep, or plead for mercy from the men she once ruled.
As the towering officer lunges forward with his heavy club, she looks directly at the centurion drawing his blade, violently tears open the front of her linen stola to bare her abdomen, and delivers her iconic final command. "Strike here," she snarls. "This carried a monster." The physical threat to the emperor was dead, struck down on her own bedroom floor. But as the young ruler secretly visited the villa to inspect her mother's brutally beaten form, commenting coldly on the beauty of her limbs, a new, far more dangerous psychological horror took root in his mind. He ordered her cremation that very night on a cheap dining couch, denying the mother of the empire a dignified funeral or a proper burial mound, terrified that a public ceremony would incite a riot. The visceral horror on the coast transitioned immediately into cold, bureaucratic terror back in the Roman Senate. The supposedly moral philosopher drafted a fabricated, highly detailed letter to the capital. He claimed the mother had sent her freedmen to assassinate the emperor, and upon being discovered, she had taken her own life out of sheer guilt. The Senate, fully aware of the lie but steeped in the brutal survival instincts of the era, voted elaborate thanks to the gods for the emperor's salvation. This political cowardice initiated the Roman practice of total condemnation of memory. Statues of the mother across the empire were violently defaced or pulled down with heavy ropes. Her name was meticulously chiseled out of marble inscriptions on public buildings. Gold and silver coins bearing her face were recalled, melted down, and restruck. The state apparatus attempted to physically delete a human being from reality, altering the historical record by force. We use the historical records to show how the political system completely enabled the emperor's lies, offering no resistance to his escalating madness. But a profound, haunting irony is revealed by the evidence.
The very act of violently erasing her from the public record etched her story permanently into the bedrock of history. But here is where the historical record demands a fundamental reevaluation of everything you thought you knew about Rome. The opening assassination on the bay and the execution in the villa wasn't the climax of his cruelty, it was merely the prologue. The destruction of his mother had fundamentally rewritten his relationship with reality, morality, and violence. The collapsing vessel of the boat had planted a deeply disturbing psychological seed in the young emperor's mind. He now understood that human beings, even those who forged him and defined him, were just raw materials. They could be broken, completely erased from existence, and physically remade to suit his desires. The contagion of his madness was no longer contained to his family. It was spreading, and the entire Roman Empire was about to become his personal, inescapable slaughterhouse. The immense psychological weight begins to ravage the emperor's mind almost immediately. Returning to the sprawling, torchlit halls of the capital, he is crippled by severe insomnia. He paces the empty marble corridors at night, terrified of the shadows dancing on the walls. According to ancient biographers, the emperor repeatedly confessed to his attendants that he was being hounded by mythological spirits of vengeance. More disturbingly, he claimed he could hear the blast of a solitary phantom trumpet echoing from the hills, sounding endlessly from his mother's unmarked grave. The guilt was not making him repentant, it was making him dangerously volatile. To escape the suffocating ghost of the woman who made him, he turns his paranoid gaze to the other women in his orbit. The year is 62 AD, and his immediate focus locks on to his 22-year-old wife, the Empress. She is an aristocratic, dignified woman, and she possesses the one thing he fundamentally lacks, the genuine, unwavering love of the Roman public. Her very existence is a political threat. She is a living, breathing reminder of his mother's calculated political arrangements, representing the legitimate bloodline that justifies his seat on the throne. Desperate to sever this final tie to his past, the emperor abruptly divorces her, falsely claiming she is barren, and marries his ambitious mistress. But the citizens of Rome do not accept this quietly. A massive public riot erupts in the streets, where the mob violently topples the marble statues of the new bride and triumphantly parades the likeness of the young empress through the forum. This outpouring of public affection seals the young woman's fate, as the emperor cannot tolerate a rival for the absolute adoration of his empire. He banishes his former wife to a desolate volcanic island in the Tyrrhenian Sea. It is a barren rock, historically used by the imperial family as an inescapable open-air prison for troublesome aristocratic women. But mere exile is no longer enough to soothe the emperor's escalating paranoia and bloodlust. A detachment of hardened military guards arrives on the rocky shores of the island. We follow the executioners as they march up to her isolated compound. The young woman, completely defenseless and abandoned by the Senate, is bound tightly with rough, heavy cords, her pleas for mercy echoing off the volcanic stone. The guards force her down to the floor and prepare to use sharp iron blades, but the human body has a physiological response to sheer, paralyzing terror, causing her blood circulation to slow down drastically. The frigid chill of fear causes her pulse to weaken, refusing to flow fast enough to kill her. Impatient, the soldiers drag the terrified woman into the superheated steam room of the Roman bathhouse. They lock the heavy wooden doors from the outside and stoke the subterranean furnaces to maximum capacity. She is suffocated to death in agony as the searing, blinding vapor fills her lungs.
The cruelty of the imperial machine does not end with her final breath. Following direct orders from the palace, the guards execute the ultimate desecration. A horrifying trophy is packed away in a heavy wooden crate, loaded onto a fast galley, and shipped across the Mediterranean back to the heart of Rome.
The gruesome package is presented directly to the emperor's new wife as physical proof that her rival has been permanently deleted from the board. The human being has been completely commodified. The fragile vessel of the body is now nothing more than a political token, easily broken and traded within the blood-soaked walls of the imperial court. Stepping back into the sterile light of the historical record, the year is 65 AD, and the macro consequences of these actions begin to destabilize the entire Western world. We must understand the historical fallout of crossing these specific moral event horizons. Once a ruler realizes there are no cosmic or legal consequences for butchering a mother and a highly popular wife, the entire architecture of the state transforms into a weapon of mass consumption. The empire watches in muted, paralyzed horror as the God King unravels. Paranoia breeds genuine treason, leading to a massive failed plot by senators to assassinate the emperor. This gives the tyrant the ultimate excuse to violently purge the Roman elite, turning the capital into a sprawling abattoir. Even his former tutor, the brilliant Stoic philosopher who had helped draft the lies covering up the mother's murder, is caught in the dragnet. The emperor orders the old man to commit suicide under suspicion of treason. Contemporary chroniclers detail a grim, almost pathetic end as the philosopher opens his veins, but his aged, frail body lacks the pressure to kill him quickly. He drinks a cup of deadly hemlock, but his poor circulation renders the poison ineffective. Finally, in a dark, poetic echo of the young empress's brutal demise, he is carried into a hot vapor bath, where the steam finally suffocates his weakened lungs. A systemic, repetitive pattern of destruction has taken hold of the regime.
The documentary reveals that it is the sudden death of his beloved second wife that exposes the absolute bottomless depths of his pathology. The ancient historian records the brutal, unglamorous reality of her demise. The new empress, heavily pregnant with his child, began arguing with the emperor over his late return from performing in the chariot races. In a flash of blind, uncontrollable rage, the emperor violently struck his pregnant wife. The blunt force trauma was catastrophic, killing both her and the unborn heir to the Roman Empire. The sudden, accidental destruction of his prized possession fractured whatever remained of his sanity. His subsequent mourning period was not standard Roman grief, it was a twisted, deeply performative obsession. He absolutely refused to cremate her body on a traditional funeral pyre, unable to bear the thought of her physical form turning to ash. He needed to preserve the vessel at all costs. He ordered court embalmers to preserve her corpse, stuffing her lifeless body with unimaginable quantities of rare spices. A highly respected contemporary natural philosopher recorded a staggering economic detail about this funeral. He noted that the emperor burned more frankincense and myrrh in the streets of Rome during the procession than the entire region of Arabia produced in a single year. He was fundamentally terrified of losing what he had destroyed. The psychological profile of the tyrant was now fully crystallized in the historical record. He could not simply kill, he had to consume, preserve, and totally possess the objects of his affection. But the death of his wife left an agonizing void in the palace that all the spices in the world could not fill. To fill that void, he would cross a boundary of human violation that horrified even the hardened, blood-soaked Roman public. The year is 66 AD, deep within the private, heavily guarded chambers of the imperial palace. The central motif of his reign, the collapsing and reshaping of the human vessel, finds its most disturbing, grotesque manifestation. The emperor discovers a young Roman freedman. The boy possesses an uncanny, terrifyingly precise physical resemblance to the dead empress. For the young ruler, peering through the lens of absolute, unchecked power,
This is not a mere coincidence of genetics. It is a divine opportunity to physically reconstruct his shattered reality. He does not see a young boy with his own life and agency. He sees raw, malleable material waiting to be sculpted. The emperor issues a chilling decree to his court physicians, ordering the boy to be surgically altered. The medical staff, operating under threat of immediate execution, alter the child's body to mimic the physical characteristics of the murdered wife. The boy is violently emptied of his own identity, hollowed out, mutilated, and stitched back together to serve as a living flesh receptacle for a ghost. The sensory details of the aftermath read like a descent into the deepest circles of madness. A massive official public wedding ceremony is organized in the heart of the capital. The boy is draped in the heavy, flame-colored silken veil traditionally worn by a Roman imperial bride. According to the ancient historians, the entire imperial court, including senators, generals, and aristocrats, were forced to attend this grotesque pageantry under the watchful eyes of the military guard. They were forced to bow to the mutilated boy and offer him lavish wedding gifts, pretending the nightmare was entirely normal. The emperor then parades the boy through the streets in an ornate imperial litter. He demands the crowds address the boy as empress. He kisses him passionately in public view and treats him entirely as his dead wife resurrected. It is the ultimate, horrifying act of possession.
He has taken a living, breathing human being and forced them to wear the skin of his own unforgivable sins. The emperor had successfully reconstructed his immediate reality, building a fleshy diorama of the life he had violently destroyed. But reality, heavily armed and furious, was about to crash through the palace doors. The macro consequences of absolute madness can only be held at bay for so long before the sheer weight of the blood collapses the foundation of the state. By the spring of the year 68 A.D., the elaborate flesh-bound illusion of his godhood completely evaporated. The reality he had tried so violently to reconstruct finally shattered against the hard, unforgiving bronze of the Roman military machine. We must step back and examine the historical documentation of this collapse to understand the mechanics of his downfall. The provinces of the Roman Empire were financially and spiritually exhausted. To fund the construction of his sprawling, gold-plated palace built over the ashes of the capital, he had bled the outer territories dry with relentless taxation. But financial ruin was secondary to the profound, empire-wide humiliation. The hardened Roman legions stationed on the frontiers refused to take orders from a man parading around the Mediterranean in a bridal veil with an altar boy. The systemic nightmare of the ruling dynasty finally broke the military's legendary discipline. A powerful provincial governor rose in open armed revolt. He was quickly backed by an aging, pragmatic general who commanded massive, battle-hardened legions. They did not march to reform the Senate, they marched to exterminate a monster. When the news of the approaching armies reached the capital, the Roman Senate, a body of men who had spent 14 years cowering in the shadows, finally found its spine. Tired of the endless, unpredictable bloodshed and the total degradation of the imperial office, they held a midnight session. In a swift, bureaucratic stroke, they officially declared the emperor an enemy of the state. Scholars note that the ancient punishment for this classification was severe. The condemned would be stripped naked, marched to the forum with a wooden fork clamped around the neck, and beaten to death with rods. We can track the rapid physical collapse of his power through the highly detailed historical records of his final 48 hours. The pendulum swings rapidly from the macro-politics of the Senate down into the claustrophobic, terrifying reality of a tyrant who suddenly realizes he is entirely alone.
It is early June in the dead of night, and he wakes up in his massive, opulent bedchamber inside the Golden Palace. He calls out for his elite guards, demanding a glass of water, but there is no answer. The silence in the cavernous room is heavier than the lead canopy that failed to crush his mother. He throws off the silk sheets and wanders out into the vast, echoing marble halls of his palace. The realization strikes him with the force of a physical blow. The palace is completely abandoned. The elite guards who swore oaths to his bloodline have fled into the city to secure their own survival. His wealthy sycophants, his musicians, and his court flatterers have vanished, stripping the gold and silver from the walls as they ran. Even the palace slaves have abandoned their posts, stealing his personal stash of poison so he cannot take the easy way out. The historical irony of this moment is palpable and deeply poetic. The man who had spent a decade utilizing the apparatus of the state to erase others from history was now being erased by the very same state. He was a ghost haunting his own house before his heart had even stopped beating. Terrified, barefoot, and shivering in a faded, dirty cloak disguised over his tunic, the emperor flees the capital. Accompanied by just 4 remaining loyal freedmen, he rides out to a muddy suburban mud-brick villa owned by his servant. They have to hide in a trench full of brambles, waiting for a secret hole to be dug through the back wall so the ruler of Rome can crawl through the dirt on his hands and knees like a feral animal.
Inside the dark, damp cell of the villa, the sound of approaching cavalry hoofs echoes across the dirt road. The Senate's execution squad is closing in. The emperor knows he must end his own life to avoid the agony of the wooden fork and the rods, but the tyrant finds himself completely paralyzed by cowardice. He weeps openly, clutching a pair of daggers, testing their sharp edges against his thumb, but refusing to press them into his flesh. As the heavy wooden doors of the compound begin to splinter under the axes of the arriving cavalry, he utters his pathetic final words, mourning the artist dying within him. Unable to summon the courage to drive the blade home, he forces his personal secretary to wrap his hands around the emperor's grip and violently shove the dagger into his throat. A Roman centurion bursts into the room a moment later, desperately trying to stem the bleeding with his cloak, hoping to keep the prize alive for a public execution. But the blood drains too fast, and the God King dies, trembling on a dirt floor, his eyes bulging in absolute terror. The tyrant is dead, and the dynasty is completely extinguished. But as the dust settles over the chaotic streets of Rome, a heavy, emotional echo lingers in the shadows. What happens to the living ghost he left behind? The empire descends into a brutal civil war as generals butcher each other for the empty throne. But deep within the shifting power structures, the boy remains. He is passed around as a macabre novelty, a highly prized political trophy claimed by the brief, violent men who seize the palace. The boy is entirely voiceless, an objectified piece of imperial furniture traded among warlords. Finally, the civil war yields a victor, a gluttonous, utterly ruthless new emperor. And under his brief, violent reign, the ultimate humiliation for the boy is ordered. He desires to entertain the Roman mob with a grand, blood-soaked spectacle in the gladiatorial arena. He commands that the youth be taken from the palace and brought to the arena's blood-stained floor. The order is clear, a public spectacle designed to humiliate, forcing the boy to reenact a dark myth of the underworld. It is to be the ultimate degradation, a cruel execution staged for the entertainment of a screaming, cheering crowd, the final punishment for a victim who saw too much of a tyrant's madness. But we return to the close cinematic point of view for the final moments.
It is the morning of the games. The air in the stone cells beneath the arena is thick with the scent of fear and cold dust. Above, the muffled roar of the Roman mob shakes the very foundation of the earth. The heavy iron gates groan as they open. The guards approach the cell of the one forced to wear the empress's likeness. But standing in the dim light, the youth makes a quiet, definitive choice. For his entire life, he had been a vessel for others, shaped, draped in silk, and forced to endure the whims of powerful men. He refuses to be the punchline of Rome's most violent joke. He refuses to let his story end as a performance for a monster. Before the guards can bind his hands and drag him into the blinding light of the arena, the boy secures a hidden, sharp iron blade. With a swift, steady hand, he takes back the only thing he has left, his exit from this world. It is a haunting final note to a forgotten history. In a world dominated by a paranoid tyrant, the ultimate tragic victory belonged to this silent soul. He reclaimed his agency. He chose his own end, leaving the ruler with nothing but a body that could no longer be forced to perform. History often sanitizes the past to protect us from the shadows of human nature. If you want to uncover the unvarnished truths that have been buried for centuries, subscribe now. Click the video on your screen, and I will see you in the archives.